All right, welcome back. Hope that you had a nice break, and let's get right down to it. Remember how in the last segment I'd said that European philologists, when they reconstructed this language called Proto-Indo-European, sort of automatically connected it to an ethnic group or a race who they then labeled as being Aryan, especially when they're thinking about India and the Indo-Aryan languages. Let's kind of dig into this idea a little bit more carefully in this segment. Now, here's how we can formulate the basic puzzle that kind of gripped the philologists and continues to grip scholars who work on the most ancient layer of Indian history. How and when did these so-called Aryans find themselves in India? Now, by Aryans, I mean specifically the people who spoke the Indo-European language of Sanskrit and not necessarily an ethnic group. Now, the old school theories that we're going to talk about all do think of the Aryans as race, but we don't have to, and we probably shouldn't. There are basically three answers to this question of how Indo-European speakers got into India, and we can call them the Aryan invasion theory, the Aryan migration theory, or the out of India theory, the AIT, the AMT, and the OIT. Now let's talk about each of these in detail. The Aryan invasion theory, the AIT, was basically the first established way of explaining how the Aryan people came into India. We already talked about it a little bit when we ran into our friend Mortimer Wheeler in the last unit, if you remember, that dude with the mustache. According to the AIT theory, the Aryans first lived in the homeland, somewhere in the Russian steppes, maybe, and entered the subcontinent through the northwest, through the Khyber Pass and other access points to get them from Persia through the Hindu Kush mountains and into India. The idea was that the Aryans had military technology that was superior to the indigenous Dravidians who were inhabiting these peaceful IVC cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. The Aryans had horses and war chariots, which allowed them to defeat the horseless, peaceful Dravidians, destroy their cities and urban cultures, and push them deep into the jungles of South India. According to the AIT theory, the Aryans then set up camp in the Punjab and spread out all across northern India over the next centuries. From this perspective, Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, all of these IVC sites are the ruins of that Proto-Dravidian culture. It's a story that's quite popular in the 19th century and even through the 1940s and 50s. Nowadays, though, you should keep in mind that the AIT theory has been pretty much debunked. Even though back then everyone believed it, nowadays no one really does. Why not? Because there's neither hard archaeological evidence nor any cultural memories or cultural texts about these so-called Aryan invasions. There's not evidence to show that it happened, and so very few legitimate scholars accept the AIT today. The second perspective can be called the Aryan migration theory, and this is what most international scholars generally subscribe to today. From this point of view, speakers of Sanskrit migrating from, again, ancestral Indo-European homelands in the Russian steppes enter India through the northwest. So that picture is the same, but the idea was that it took place really slowly and in a number of different waves. These were peaceful dispersals of people who were largely pastoral and practiced limited forms of agriculture. Instead, they herded cattle and sheep in the countryside, and they spread slowly with their cattle and sheep all across Europe and Asia, and they entered into India by around 1500 BCE. This would have been 400 years after the end of the mature urban period of the IVC, so they wouldn't have encountered Harappa or Mohenjo-daro or any of these cities, but would have met with simple rural communities of Dravidian and Mundari speakers who weren't really much different than how they themselves lived. They also raised cattle and sheep and so on. Some scholars like Mark Knoyer at Wisconsin actually propose an interesting idea that maybe the Indo-European speakers were around in the IVC even as early as the mature phase, 2000 BC even, but were always a minority population within the kind of multicultural environment of the IVC. And that would explain why we don't find horses in the cities. They were a minority. According to the AMT, these Indo-European speakers, once they arrived in India, thoroughly intermingled with the existing ethnic groups and adapted and absorbed their cultural features. This would have happened again over and over in the course of hundreds of years through subtle waves of cultural change, not one fell swoop. Eventually, this hybridized culture grew and spread from the Punjab through the rest of northern India, but didn't really make headway into the south until much later because of the kind of jungles and mountains that lie in between. So that's how the AMT story goes, and it's what Tom Troutman labels as the current established scholarly view. Most people who study ancient Indian history do accept this version of events, in principle at least, and if someone wants to come up with a new view, it's this view, the AMT, that has to be challenged and refuted, not the old AIT, the Aryan invasion theory, which has already been abandoned by serious scholars. So now the more controversial stuff. There's now a third theory that offers an alternative to the established view, which we can call the out of India theory, OIT. From this perspective, there wasn't an invasion or a migration of any Aryans into India from the outside. Instead, the people who built the IVC cities were the Aryans. It was Vedic culture. IVC culture was Vedic culture. The undeciphered script of the IVC is actually Sanskrit. It's really kind of a massive revisionist hypothesis that says everything that the European scholars and researchers are telling you is all wrong, right? According to OIT, it means that the Vedic culture is much older than currently proposed. Now, currently we say it's around 1200 BC, but if the IVC culture is Vedic culture, then it would push back the dating of Vedic culture all the way back to what? 6000, 7000 BC. The OIT theory also advocates that there's been a continuous cultural development in India from the time of the IVC that has nothing to do with any Aryans coming into India from outside. IVC crafts naturally evolved into that grayware pottery that we find, or the IVC religion naturally evolved into Hinduism. From this perspective, the Indo-European homeland wasn't the Russian steppe, it wasn't Turkey or whatever, but actually it was India itself. And waves of immigrants migrated out of India and traveled for centuries all the way up through Turkey, Central Asia, all the way over to Ireland, right? Of course, like the other theories, there really isn't any archaeological evidence or any cultural or textual memories that support claims of these kind of migrations either. Troutman has labeled this as the alternative view in opposition to the established view, and he notes that most of its proponents are not professionally trained as historians and also tend to have kind of overtly religious or political motivations for why they like the OIT theory. Because if we do accept the OIT model, it means that India is the motherland of all European culture and Persian culture and so on. And it pushes the date of Hinduism all the way back to 7000 BC, making it the oldest religion on the planet. Right? So there's a lot of pride and kind of self-validation going on here. Maybe a bit too much passion gets involved when making these kinds of claims of origination and so on. While there are, of course, limitations and problems with the standard view of the Aryan debate, the adherents of the OIT, if I can be frank, push their agenda in a way that's often quite hostile, combative, and anti-intellectual. We'll explore this really vexing question of the debate around the AIT and the OIT and the AMT and so on in the last segment of the unit, so stick around.